everyone, it's me, Pastel Fire. Sorry I've been gone for so long. I was taking a short break from my YouTube channel. So today I will be talking about 90s kids, and I would be discussing and giving evidence on why I dislike most of the 90s kids, most of the 90s fans, and most of the nostalgia fans in general. Please keep in mind that I said most, not all. I am aware that there are 90s kids / 90s fans that don't obsess with the 90s, and I am aware that there are nostalgia fans that just like aspects of their childhood. I am just ranting on how some 90s kids complain about this generation always on technology. Even though they are 20 years old, they are still part of the gen. How they keep calling themselves 90s kids, even though most not bratty 90s fans are actually 90s babies, and basically the obsession of 90s media as a whole. With that all being said, enjoy the video.
I'm mad at Disney, they tricked.
These people are one of the most annoying idiots that I have come across to. Just because you were born in the 90s does not make you a 90s kid. On average, you start having memories when you're 3 to 4 years old, although some can have them earlier, that this is the majority we're talking about, not the minority. Most of the people claiming to be 90s kids were actually born between 1996 to 1999. So they actually started having memories in the early 2000s, since by the time the early 2000s started, they were 3 to 4 years old, which are the two ages kids can start having memories. So to all of those late 90s babies who claim that they are 90s kids, just because you were born in the 90s does not make you a 90s kid. You didn't even experience at least half of the 90s decade. All you did was eat crayons while peeing your pants. You didn't even spend half of your childhood in the 90s, and you were little babies and toddlers. You're 2000s kids. End of story.
I'm mad at Disney, they tricked me.
90s kids, let me ask you a question. Who cares about your decade's TV shows? The past is the past. Your shows were canceled over a decade ago. Quit whining on how all TV shows from the present are bad, because the truth is, it's not. Most of you 90s kids are adults now, so it makes sense that you hate shows that are made for children. Go back and watch Cow and Chicken. I bet it isn't as good as you remember.
Disney, they tricked me, had me wishing on a
Person 1. God, my 7-year-old sibling loves playing outside. We even have a little tree house. And they. Person 2. Your sister isn't a 90s kid, and only 90s kids remember outside. Stop lying. She obviously has a billion iPhones and is obsessed with the Kardashians. Nice try, stupid 2000s plus child. Person 1. Idiot, the 90s did not create outside, and not only 90s kids remember it. This meme started to be okay and mediocre, but it soon started an era of cancerous memes. Sometimes 90s kids take stuff that didn't even originate in the 90s. I once saw a meme and it said only 90s kids remember. It had the Instagram logo. I'm sorry, 90s kids, but Instagram isn't a 90s or 2000s thing. In fact, it's a 2010s thing, having started in 2010. Even Insta's parent company, Facebook, started in 2004, for God's sake. Also, there's other things 90s kids try to claim, from playgrounds to SpongeBob and other stuff that the 90s didn't invent. Here is a list of the following things 90s kids try to claim that wasn't even created in the 90s. VHSs, they were created in the 70s. Walkmans, like VHSs, they were created in the 70s, 20 years before the 90s even began. Playgrounds. Just because the 90s played a lot outside does not mean they created it. Besides, playgrounds and parks still exist. SpongeBob. Okay, technically it is a 90s TV show, but it was created in 1999, and it was on air for 7 months before the 2000s started. Compare the 90s 7 months to the 2000s 10 years. I'd consider it a 2000s show. Drake and Josh. The first episode was in 2004, 40 years into the 2000s. It is in no way a 90s show, 90s kids. Avatar: The Last Airbender. This show started in 2004, just like Drake and Josh's case, 4 years after the 2000s began. Smosh, Ignoring Orange, Fred, Ray, William Johnson. YouTube didn't even exist until 2005, 5 years after the 2000s started. Besides, those channels started to actually gain popularity in the mid to late 2000s, 2006 to 2009. YouTube is not a 90s thing, a 2000s thing, a 2010s thing, or even a 2020s thing. I think it's a mix of a 2000s thing and 2010s thing, because a lot of the channels started gaining traction in the late 2000s and early 2010s. It is in no way a 90s thing, 90s kids.
Disney, they tricked me, had me wishing.
I actually think that the 90s kids are the people that are spending the most time on the internet, not the new gen. You want to know why I think that way? It's because unlike the new gen, who just mind their own business, 90s kids love to brag on how the 90s had no technology and how they played outside and such. If they are so outside, yes, techno, if they are so old school, then I'd like them to throw all the modern technology and replace it with an old crappy 90s TV that only has 4 channels. I like to see 90s kids climb trees and wear outdated fashion. Seems impossible. A message to all 90s kids who do this: let the new generation grow up in their generation. Sure, the 2020s may or may not be the same as the 90s, but one day the new gen is going to get older and look back at the 2020s and say, wow, that was a good time. Just like how the 90s kids look back at the 90s and say, wow, that was a good time. I think the only reason why 90s kids say that the 90s were the best time to be a kid is because they were children at the time, never looking at the news. In fact, the 90s were also pretty bad, having the Yugoslav wars and the Colombian shooting in 1999, etc. The only reason why 90s kids say that the present is bad is because they're adults now. They're nostalgic for the past, and they basically dislike everything after in the 90s because they're nostalgic for a different time period. 90s kids, the new gen is going to grow up soon, and in the 2040s or even sooner, the gen is going to start being nostalgic for the 2020s. So to 90s kids, please let the new gen have their chance to have their childhoods. Then in the future, they will be obsessing over the 2020/2030s, since they had most of their childhood in those decades.
Me had me wishing on a shooting star.
Anyways, thank you so much for watching my rant on 90s kids. And to the actual sane 90s kids, I am not talking about all 90s kids. I am only ranting on the 90s kids that praise the 90s, acting like there are no problems in the decade, while hating on other decades, specifically the 2010s, hating on it only for a few problems. It is okay to be nostalgic for your childhood as long as you realize that there was problems in the decade you grew up in, just like any other decades, and that you don't bash new TV shows just because they weren't as good as your childhood favorites. Please remember to like and subscribe so I can hit 200 subs by the end of November. Thank you for watching, and as always, bye.